Okay, why don't we get started this evening? Good evening, everyone. My name is Caleb Rossico, and I'd like to thank you for joining us at the July 9th Q&A session to talk about the Module 1 of the Atlanta Zoning Ordinance rewrite. What we wanted to do this evening is really use this primarily as an opportunity to hear from stakeholders in the city of Atlanta about their thoughts on the zoning ordinance now that they've been able to review the draft Module 1. We will have both a series of questions and answers that were submitted in advance. And then about halfway through the meeting, maybe a third through the meeting, we'll have an opportunity for folks to ask questions in real time. On that note, I did want to let everyone know that there will be a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom page that you will be able to use to actually ask questions. But that button will not actually come through to us until the appropriate time. So if you put questions in the chat, please know that we're not monitoring them. We really ask you to please hold off on any questions until after the presentation, and then use the Q&A feature to reach out to us, and one of us will answer it. Additionally, what we wanted to do was talk very briefly about next steps, but primarily, again, use this as an opportunity to hear from you. We've put forth a draft zoning ordinance, Module 1, for consideration, and really want to use this as an opportunity to hear the many questions that we're sure you have. But before I do that, I did want to start with a brief background. We have over 800 people registered for the event this evening, and we know that all of them may not have gone to previous zoning meetings related to this effort. So I wanted to spend about 5 minutes just bringing everyone up to speed on sort of what we've been working on, what this process is about, and how it fits into the bigger process of the Atlanta zoning ordinance. The other thing I wanted to mention is that this zoning ordinance rewrite is part of a dual effort by the City of Atlanta, the Department of City Planning, to look at updating both the comprehensive plan, which is the vision for the city, the plan for the City of Atlanta, and then the zoning regulations that support that plan. I like to differentiate the two as the plan, the comprehensive plan really being the plan, the vision, and the zoning being the law. To that end, our team has coordinated very closely with the team that is working on the comprehensive plan, and are truly excited to have this as an opportunity to really do what planners love to do, which is to formulate a community-based vision for a jurisdiction and for a city, and then work on the development regulations. So there's a constant back and forth between our team, the zoning team, and the comprehensive development plan, especially as it comes to sharing comments, sharing public information. If you would like to learn more about the comprehensive plan, there is a website, atlantaforall.com, and you can go there. There's a draft plan for review, and there's also some conversation in there about how that plan would relate to some of the existing zoning districts that the city has. And very importantly, these processes are both coordinated in terms of timing. We have been working on the zoning ordinance for about 4 years now. We started with a research and analysis phase, worked with you at a series of public meetings to explore alternatives, to see which ideas may be appropriate for the City of Atlanta and may not be appropriate. But now we're in really the important part of the process, which is to put forth draft ordinances for your consideration. And I do really want to emphasize the fact that these are, in fact, draft documents. Nothing is final, nothing is set in stone. We're having these and future meetings because we want to hear from you and we want to revise the code based on that. The comprehensive plan is working sort of in a parallel process. They're working with communities to identify policies for land use and development patterns in the city. And at the end of the day, the zoning ordinance will be adopted, and it will have the ability to implement some of the ideas that are coming out of the comprehensive plan at a later point in time. So tonight, we are here to primarily talk about the first module of the zoning ordinance. If you've had an opportunity to look at our project website, which is atlzoning.com, you will have noticed that we are releasing this draft zoning ordinance in a series of 3, what we're calling modules. And basically what modules are is different parts of the zoning ordinance. And we're doing that because, first of all, the zoning is going to be a very long document, and it makes a lot of sense to have discrete conversations about discrete pieces. So this first module is really about the zoning districts and use standards that the city uses. We're calling this module 1, frontage, form and frontage and use, and it contains all of the sort of basic regulations that you would find in a zoning district, things like allowable density, things like allowable uses, and things like use standards. Now, I did want to mention that, again, these are discussion drafts. Many of you have commented on the graphics, and we own upfront. The graphics are all placeholders at this point in time, but the text and the words and the regulation drafts are really what we would like to focus on. And so one of the other very exciting things about this effort is that we are proposing a relatively new approach to how the city of Atlanta has zoning districts today. Today, if you look at the zoning map, you will see a series of letters and numbers, R1, R2, MRC1, MRC2. These things are what we call zoning districts. Under this new approach, however, we are breaking them into two discrete pieces. The one piece is what we're calling form and frontage, which relates to the physical layout of a district, meaning the height, the intensity, the size of buildings. The second part of the zoning district is going to be what we're calling the use district, meaning what kind of activities are permitted on the property. So in much the same way that you can look at the zoning map today and you can see R1 and you know it means residential, and then 1 has certain standards, you will be able to look at the new zoning map and see a combination of physical form and frontage districts and use districts. And again, they are intended to really reflect the physical design of the city, really the characteristics of our many diverse neighborhoods, and ensure that new development respects and protects the vision of those neighborhoods where appropriate, and then very importantly, supports appropriate growth and change as called for in the city plans. Now, these form and frontage districts have been guided by the existing zoning that we have. We've converted those to the new nomenclature. And as I mentioned before, we received over 10,000 comments to date related to zoning and development, either through our process or through the CDP process. And we've also incorporated a lot of that. These are generally organized into various categories, going from house district all the way up to commercial and mixed use areas, and finally industrial and institutional. No big change here, except that they're primarily regulated by the size of the buildings, the layout of the buildings, but not always what is in the buildings. What is in the buildings is controlled by the use districts. These really regulate the uses and activity of the property, much like the previous slides. These are created by converting existing zoning that we have, by looking at the comments received to date. And then very importantly, we heard from you early on in the process that there are a lot of uses that have potentially negative impacts on neighborhoods, negative impacts on communities. And so we've tried to focus on thinking about the impacts and minimizing those negativities. These are, again, organized into a use table that sort of shows all of the allowances in various parts of the city. They're residential, primarily single family, and then primarily a mixed residential one. And then everything from commercial up to industrial. Now, that's what we're here to talk about tonight. But I also wanted to mention that a lot of the questions received to date are about other parts of the code, which will be forthcoming. The next module, which will be released later this year, is going to be called Module 2, Development Standards. This will talk about things like, do we use density bonuses? Do we have connectivity requirements? How do we measure things like floor area and building height and windows and fenestrations and fences? Really, all of the things in a zoning district that are other than the primary use, intensity, and bulk of it. And then finally, after that, there will be a final module presented that will focus on the administration of the zoning ordinance. This is really probably the least glamorous part because it doesn't really have any physical outcome, but it does define how is rezoning going to occur? How do we permit developments? How do we address things that may not be legal under the new code? So all of those sort of things, all of the sort of technical and somewhat legal provisions are going to be in that third module. And then finally, I did want to mention, again, did want to own up to the fact that a lot of the comments received today are things other than zoning. And even though we're not working on modifying those other ordinances, we are collaborating with the departments of the city responsible for those. We've received a lot of comments about tree protection, and in module 2, we are going to have some incentives for tree protection. We've received comments about stormwater, noise, building codes, and housing codes. So even though those are not technically in the zoning ordinance, those are parts of other city codes that we are coordinating with. And then the final piece before I go into answering your questions is I wanted to remind everyone that as currently envisioned, this zoning ordinance update is going to be about primarily converting existing zoning districts into the new way of regulating zones. So we're not necessarily going to zone property from residential to commercial or from industrial to mixed use. Rather, the outcome of this Atlanta 2.0 will be a newly adopted zoning map that pretty much converts from your current zoning to the new name, if you will. And that future city initiatives, such as the ongoing comprehensive development plan, area plans, other policy changes, those can be used to apply these new zoning districts more significantly down the road. And if you've looked at the draft, you will have noticed that there's a very long table showing all 240 some odd zoning districts in the city, what their current name is, and then how they translate into the new form of frontage and use districts. So that's a little bit of background, but what we really wanted to do this evening was to begin to answer your questions. And so the way we're going to do this is we received several hundred comments to date related to various questions about the draft ordinance or other sort of zoning efforts. This evening, myself, Caleb Rossico, Director Kieta Homes with the Office of Zoning and Development, and Christy Dodson are going to go through answering a series of those questions that were submitted in advance, and then give you an opportunity to ask additional ones. So generally speaking, the comments that were received fall into 5 categories. There were a lot of questions about what are we doing with the R1 through R5? These are really the house or the single family neighbors in the city. How is that being incorporated into this new zoning ordinance? Related to that, there were a lot of questions about accessory units, guest houses, accessory dwelling units. So we have a long presentation with images sort of showing you how we envision all of that working. Several folks also asked about how we're handling the multifamily districts, the parts of the city that allow larger apartment buildings, townhomes, that sort of thing. We have a couple questions related to use, and then many questions related to definitions and measurements, which, even though that's really in module 2, we recognize that a lot of the discussion on module 1 really depends on knowing what those answers are. So the first question is relatively easy. If you have looked at the zoning table, you will have noticed that one of the use... Please try again. Sorry, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. You'll have noticed that one of the use districts, U2, incorrectly lists eating and drinking establishments. I wanted to say right at the beginning of this meeting that is an error. That was a Scrivener's error on my part, and we do not propose allowing eating and drinking establishments in U2 as of right as part of this code. So that will be fixed. Another one that was a typo, if you will, was that we had inadvertently left out private clubs as being allowed in these sort of R1 through R5 districts. They are allowed in those districts today by special use permit, and they will be allowed in those districts in the future if the code is adopted as envisioned. We also received some questions about bed and breakfast. And this one is a little bit more complicated, but several of you were sort of asking, why does the draft zoning allow bed and breakfast in so many areas? And the reason for that is a little bit nuanced, and I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. The first thing I wanted to say is that the city of Atlanta has had standards that allow bed and breakfast in fairly large, architecturally and historically significant houses for many, many years. These are different from things like Airbnb and short-term rental. Those are not what this definition includes. What a bed and breakfast is under city code is again, a fairly large house that has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either as a landmark or designated property or within a historic district. It must have between 3 and 8 bedrooms. It must be at least 1,200 square feet. It may include meals. And here's the big one. It has to be owner occupied. So again, there's several of these that I can think of in Inman Park. There are a couple of these on, I believe it's Piedmont Avenue in Midtown. So these are very, very restricted today in the city of Atlanta, but they are allowed in certain areas. So what we wanted to do here, and I apologize, these charts are going to get into the weeds, is first wanted to summarize where bed and breakfast were permitted today. And in the existing column, you'll see that they are permitted in a series of SPI districts. And again, we have a lot of them in other parts of the city that are effectively grandfathered legal non-conforming use. So these various districts at the left, when they convert to the new zoning district as U1, they're actually, generally speaking, not proposed to be allowed. That is very consistent with the current standards when you actually map where these zoning districts are today, with the exception that sub-area 6 in Washington Park could not do them under the draft, but there really aren't any large houses in that part of the city that would satisfy anyway. So it really is a technical prohibition. Now, where it gets different is that the citywide U2 district, and this is primarily a lot of the older neighborhoods in the city, theoretically would be allowed to have a bed and breakfast that meets all these requirements if they were zoned R4 today, or if they were zoned R4A today. There are a couple neighborhoods that I'm going to point out to let you see that may theoretically have this situation. They could also possibly occur in the Mechanicsville district, but other than that, there are very few changes to where these could actually occur. So even though you look at the zoning map and you see that we have a lot of properties that could theoretically be zoned or that could theoretically have a bed and breakfast, when you apply the fact that they have to be a federally designated historic district, the number really shrinks significantly. But the table before you shows what those districts, what those neighborhoods may be. Again, this is put forth for discussion, but they are a lot of the older neighborhoods. My neighborhood in West End, Grant Park, Inman Park, which already has some parts of Fourth Ward. They're really those parts of the neighborhoods that are designated historic today, theoretically could have a bed and breakfast under this proposal as currently written. Of course, again, all that is draft. The other question that a lot of folks had asked about is what happens to the neighborhoods today that have what are called special public interest districts, which is a type of zoning district that include architectural standards. If you've ever looked at the Atlanta zoning code, you'll know that there are some neighborhoods like Ashview Heights, Vine City, English Avenue, little bit of Mechanicsville, that have what are very architectural standards. They talk about window design, they talk a little bit about material. These standards are not within the form and frontage districts, but they will be incorporated into the new zoning code as follows. We envision that any of this sort of architectural standard, meaning the sort of design of the building, will be addressed through an architectural overlay. So you would be able to look at the zoning map, you would be able to look at, for example, Ashview Heights, you would see what the underlying zoning was, and then you would see that there were additional architectural standards that would apply there. So by no means are we getting rid of these. These are things that were very carefully crafted with a lot of community input, but they are going to be moved to an overlay versus being in the sort of form and frontage standards. Similarly, we've received a lot of questions about historic districts, and I believe I mentioned this at the last meeting on May 20th, but there are no changes proposed to the historic preservation ordinance other than converting the terminology into the terminology that we're using in the rest of the zoning ordinance. So if a district is a historic district today, again, I'll pick on my neighborhood, West End, it will continue to be a historic district in the future. It will continue to have all of the compatibility rule and Urban Design Commission requirements. Nothing would change there, except, if there was a standard in the underlying zoning that wasn't regulated by the historic district. We have a couple of multifamily projects where that would apply. That would change, but the historic standard, the standard that regulates the preservation of the historic buildings and the design of new construction, would not change in any way, shape, or form. And then one of the final questions that we received about the R1 and R5 districts is it pertains to what we're calling residential conservation districts. And I touched upon these a little bit at the meeting on May 20th. What these are they are newly created zoning tools that would be available for what are effectively R3 and R4 districts today. So the larger lots, oftentimes ranch houses, that want to preserve that character of the 1-story house or the 1.5-story house, but they want to do that without becoming a historic district. So for example, if you had a certain ranch neighborhood, perhaps along Cascade Road, where the neighbors, through their city council member, were able to say, we don't want to be R3 anymore. We want to be an R3 conservation district because we want to limit houses to the height of existing houses. This would be a tool that could do that. But again, it will not be applied at the adoption of the code, but would be available for neighborhoods that want to do that without going through the process of becoming a full-fledged historic district. A lot of you have asked for that, and so we felt it was very appropriate to create that tool. I'm going to turn it over to Director Holmes to talk about the next questions.
Good evening, everyone. My first question is, why aren't allowed fence heights being increased? Well, one answer to that question is that we have not received significant requests to increase the height of fences as they are from what they are now. I brought along with me a few visual aids. If you have been around the city for a while, you remember this cover of the book from 1982, where the fence heights were first established. In this code section, you will find that in R1 through R5, the height of fences was 4 feet in the front yard and half depth front yard and 6 feet in the side and the rear yards. That was carried over to regulations that currently now exist. I printed off of the computer this morning, and you can be found in section 1628.008.5. Again, that is section 1628.0085, where you will find the fence heights for residential properties R1 through R5, properties that are zoned RG, and then properties that are also zoned I1. It has been consistent since it was adopted in 1977, and we, as a part of the zoning ordinance, are not proposing to change that in any way unless there is significant requests to increase the fence heights. Please note, however, that if the fence height is increased, it will be applicable to the entire city because it is a general requirement. Meaning, if you want to increase the front yard from 4 feet to 6 feet, it will be 6 feet in all yards, and you will have to consider opacity and the safety of persons who are traveling along the local streets where these fences would be adjacent to. Next, we'll talk about what is the thinking behind the proposed guest unit and accessory unit standards. Properties, larger lots, those that are currently zoned R1 through R3A, have large lots. They're between 2 acres down to about 18,000 square feet, very large lots. And those properties have accessory uses that are permitted, right? So they are allowed to construct accessory units that are called right now in the code and have been called in the code since 1977. They can be greenhouses, they can be barns for keeping horses, they can be guest houses or servants' quarters and lodging facilities, swimming pools, structures for active construction projects, devices for generation of energy, amateur radio, because they're very, very large lots. And so the thinking was that those guest houses would be more appropriate or guest units would be more appropriate in the larger lot areas because they have more space and they can manifest themselves into any of those 8 permitted accessory uses in any of those districts from chapter 3 to chapter 05A. With regard, these units cannot now have stoves. This is a major issue that is usually a lot of confusion is between what is an accessory dwelling unit and what is an accessory structure once it was introduced. An accessory dwelling unit was introduced in 2017. In a guest house, no stove is currently allowed. It may be attached or it may be detached from the primary unit. It does not count towards the allowable floor area in most of those larger districts, and it may be used for short-term rental. So that's what a guest unit is, or an accessory unit is in the new code, as it will be called. With regard to existing term accessory dwelling units, an accessory dwelling unit was introduced into the city's code in 2017. It was introduced first into the R5 zoning district, which is found in chapter 7. You will find it as an accessory use in the accessory uses and structure section of that chapter, item number 12. That you will see the allowance of an accessory dwelling unit. An accessory dwelling unit in the city of Atlanta can have a stove. However, it is limited in size. It cannot be larger than 750 square feet. It must be detached from the primary unit. It does not count towards the allowable floor area, and it may be used for short-term rental. Now, what are we proposing in the new code? In the new code, we are proposing to call one a guest unit and one an accessory unit, but the uses are not going to change. What is going to change is that all of them will be allowed to have a stove, because as you saw the pictures that are circulating while I was speaking, you will notice that you cannot tell the difference between an accessory dwelling unit or a guest house. The structures look exactly the same. And as many of you know from code enforcement, unless code enforcement is allowed inside of the structure, there's no way to determine whether or not a stove has been installed or not. The loophole that many of us know about is that once the structure has been permitted here in the city, what happens most often is people go back into those units and then put stoves in those units. So what is being given in the new code is that everyone will have a stove. However, the one will be called a guest unit in the larger lots, R1 through R3A, and then in the smaller lots, R4 through R5 will be accessory dwelling units. Now, let's talk about the limitations. Accessory dwelling units will have one per single lot. So you will be allowed to have one single accessory dwelling unit. You will also be able to have, if you have a duplex on the property as you do today, and you zero lot line the property, you will be able to have one accessory dwelling unit per subdivided or per divided lot for real estate purposes. We're also giving you an increase of 100 square feet to 850 square feet for that accessory dwelling unit. Now, guest houses and servants' quarters and caretaker lodges. Those will be limited to 30% of the primary structure. 30% of the primary structure, if it is a home of 2,000 or 2,500 or 5,000 square feet, it will be limited to 30% of the primary structure because there is more land to deal with. The distinction is more land and less land. In accordance to the chart, an existing guest house is allowed in R1 through R5 and some SPIs. That is current code language where you can find in each of the chapters R1 through R5. In addition to an existing guest house, there is an existing accessory dwelling unit permitted in R4A, R4, R5, and some SPIs. The proposed guest units will be one per lot and will only be allowed in the larger lots, R1, RH1 through RH. I'm sorry, I don't know the nomenclature yet, so I don't want to say that. And then a proposed accessory unit will be allowed in uses U2 and U4. For the unit floor area, right now, an accessory dwelling unit is 750 square feet maximum per those zoning districts. For a guest house, it is 30% of the primary structure's floor area. For U1, they will be unlimited, except the total floor area of all accessory structures cannot exceed 30% of the primary floor area. And then the accessory dwelling unit in U2 and U4 will only be 850 square feet. With regard to the total floor area, an existing guest house does not count toward the total floor area today. The accessory dwelling unit does not count towards the total floor area today. What we're proposing for guest units, it will count towards the floor area. For an accessory dwelling unit or an accessory unit, it will also count towards the total floor area of the lot, which means we are granting you more in the accessory unit structure. However, we are capping it on the FAR of the entire site. So we're pulling all of that down. For an existing guest house, it may be attached or detached from the primary structure. And for an existing accessory dwelling unit, it must be detached today. What U1 proposes is that it be attached and or detached. And for U2 and U4, it can be attached or detached. And currently in the city of Atlanta, there are accessory dwelling units in some of the non-conforming structures in some of our older neighborhoods where those units were primarily allowed prior to zoning being adopted here in the city. Today, in an existing guest house, there is no stove allowed, and in an existing accessory dwelling unit, a stove is allowed. We are proposing both in U1 and in U2 and U4 that a stove be permitted in either of a guest unit or an accessory unit. With regard to owner occupancy, in an existing guest house, owner occupancy is not required today. And in an accessory dwelling unit, it is required for those properties that have short-term rental. For U1 guest houses, we will require that it be owner occupied. And for U2 and U4, we will require that an accessory unit is not owner occupied. It is not required to be owner occupied. Now, let's move on to the setbacks for accessory and primary structures. When the regulations were adopted for R5 for accessory dwelling units, there were regulations that were adopted with regard to the setbacks. However, in Quick Fixes Phase 2, when the regulations were added for accessory dwelling units in R4 and R4A, they were not added. So we have two differences. Why? We have two differences, and we need to figure out which one is the best way to go. One would require that all buildings on the property be inside the buildable area. That's an approach. The second approach is to have two different ones requiring a certain separation between the primary units and then a different setback for the accessory units that are on the property. That is up for discussion, and we would like to have your input on that.
Great. The next question is one that Director Holmes and I are going to sort of tag team on because it's fairly complicated. This question, as I mentioned earlier, relates to how we are converting what are called really the multifamily districts in the city of Atlanta, which are called RG or residential general on the zoning map. And in some places they're called MR, which is multifamily residential on the zoning map. But people have been asking sort of how we are translating those into the new nomenclature, and then why we are proposing to allow commercial uses in some of those. So I will start very briefly with a sort of overview of what those regulations are today. And Director Holmes, feel free to jump in if I get anything wrong. Now, the residential general zoning district is an older district dating from 82 that is primarily intended to support garden apartments. So if you think of
properties,
yes,
think post properties with regard to RG.
So if you've been in Atlanta any sort of time, you will have seen there were a huge number of garden apartments built around the city at that time. They all tended to be set very, very far from the street. They often had parking lots on their edges, very sort of suburban in nature. So that is really what the RG district was intentionally intended to create. Starting in the late 1990s, the city of Atlanta began a process of gradually moving away from RG in favor of a new multifamily district called MR, multifamily residential. This was created as a parallel district to RG. And what we mean by parallel is that the density for all the different types of MR was equivalent to the density of all the different types of RG. So for example, there was a RG3 and an MR3. There was an RG4 and an MR4, and so on. The difference, however, was that the multifamily residential districts were intended to incorporate what I would call basic urban design standards. So what does that mean? Well, it means no more large front parking lots. It means pulling the buildings to the street. It means putting in wider sidewalks. It means sort of having windows and doors on the street. But generally speaking, they were parallel and identical for the most part in terms of what you could do in them and how much of it you could do. Now, the one thing that is interesting, and I'll let Director Holmes speak on this momentarily, is that a lot of folks don't realize that RG today, even though it's called a multifamily district, a sort of apartment district, it does allow for limited commercial uses. Again, go to the zoning ordinance today, and if you have an apartment complex with more than 50 units in any RG district, you are allowed to have resident-oriented commercial uses. There is no question about that. You don't have to get any special approval from the city. It is permitted by right. And so when the MR was created, as I mentioned before, it incorporated that allowance, but it took away the 50 unit limit. And instead of that, it required the businesses to be relatively small. So they would be more neighborhood scale. They wouldn't be something that would draw people from, adjacent neighborhoods. Think a little grocer or a little, tailor or something like that. Very, very small uses. And so when we have converted the districts to the new form and frontage and the proposed use, the first thing that we have done, step one, is to convert the RG into their equivalent MR. So RG1 becomes MR1, RG3 becomes MR3, and so forth. And then we've converted that MR district into the form and frontage standards, which is why when you look at some of the districts today, for example, the conversion of RG3, RG4, and RG5, there is a proposal, again, all this is for discussion, to allow those very, very small commercial uses, because those very, very small commercial uses are allowed in the equivalent MR today. Director Holmes, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just want everyone to know that today, if a property in RG has 50 units or more, there is resident-oriented, non-residential that is permitted by right. That is in the code today. It is an allowable use. And the MR district also allows non-residential as well. However, it is limited. So when we converted RG to MR, with regard to the form and frontage standards and maintained the allowances that MR has today, that non-residential would stay. However, it would be limited in size and would be allowed in units that are 50 or more, or whatever it is that we decide as a community is best for the city.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to also mention some of the folks who have, and thank you, by the way, for reading the draft ordinance so carefully. We've received some really wonderful detailed comments. One of the questions was, why were we not treating RG3 and MR4 to the same? And that was an error. They will be treated the same in the next draft. So we'll be correcting that. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Christy. Actually, there is one more thing, sorry, related to these multifamily districts. Several of you had asked about why does the proposed RG3 equivalent allow 5-story buildings when many RG3 sites are on small lots in neighborhoods. The comment was we should encourage affordable, naturally occurring affordable housing. You know, these are the older brick apartment buildings that you'll see in Inman Park, you'll see in Midtown, you'll see in Reynoldstown, you'll see in Vine City. They're all over the city. And I think the commenters are correct. These are really important, naturally occurring affordable housing. And so we did a little bit of research in this because this is obviously a very important consideration. And we looked through every single property in the city of Atlanta that was zoned RG3 to really understand if the 5-story height was appropriate or not. What we found, as we sort of suspected, is that almost every RG3 property in the city is either 2 or 3 stories. They're, you know, like this house, which I believe is in Grant Park, this building in Grant Park, but don't quote me on that. There are a couple that are 4 or 5 stories, but these tend to be adjacent to an interstate where they can sort of agglomerate right of way on the interstate towards their density. And there were a couple of buildings primarily owned by the state of Georgia, so they don't have to follow zoning, that were taller than that in the RG3 today. When we looked at the MR3, which is equivalent, again, we found most of the buildings were 2 or 3 stories. In fact, the majority of MR3 is what I would call townhouse development. Only 3 were 4 stories and none were taller than 4 stories. And so with that said, the proposal, if you will, to limit it to 5 is something that is in keeping with the current development patterns. As Christy will talk about in a moment, there are height restrictions that apply in some of the smaller lots. And so even though the zoning map would maybe say that it could be 5 stories, there are height planes that are going to come into play and affect those as well. So we feel fairly comfortable that the conversion of RG3 into that scale that we initially proposed is appropriate given the existing on the ground patterns. But again, we're certainly willing to take additional comments. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christy to talk about some other very important aspects. Christy?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. So the first question I'm going to cover is about combination uses and how those will be handled. The example that was given in this question was something that is a restaurant, but also is an event venue and is a performance venue. So how do we think about these combination of uses when they may be allowed and when they wouldn't be allowed? So we'll think of combination uses in 2 types of ways, and I'll go through each one of those and the criteria of how we differentiate between the 2. The first is when there are multiple principal uses, and the second is when there's a principal use and then associated accessory uses with that. So let's think about the first example when there are multiple principal uses on a property, and those would only be allowed when all of those uses are allowed in that use district. And so this photo is an example of that, something that is a coffee shop and something like a bike shop, or maybe a coffee shop and a plant store. And I think even in the instance of this question, where they're asking a restaurant and an event venue, that would only be allowed if those two principal uses are allowed in that particular use district and it met all of the use standards associated with that district. And so those would be considered principal uses. They are primary uses on that particular property. And they're not necessarily in support of one another. So how do we then think about the differentiation between principal uses with supporting accessory uses? So we do have some accessory uses listed on the use table. So take a look at that. And we tried to pull out some particular accessory uses and ones that needed some use standards associated with those. But just because they're not listed on that accessory use table doesn't mean they couldn't be an accessory use. And so we set some criteria, and you will see this language in the next module that rolls out, but I do want to present it here as a conversation point. So if an accessory use is not listed in that accessory use table that we've rolled out with module 1, how do we think about it? When would it be allowed? And there's some criteria that's important. It must be clearly incidental and customarily found in connection with that allowed principal use. It has to be subordinate to and serving that principal use. It needs to be subordinate in area, extent, and purpose. It needs to be located on the same lot as that principal use. And an example of this is something like an apartment building that has storage units, but those are only available for those residents. So it's different from something that would have self-storage and multifamily. It's not that. The storage units are very clearly subordinate, they're very clearly incidental, and they're only serving that primary use. And so it's an important distinction. And so we have that criteria in there to differentiate between the two. So I'm going to move a bit from use. And can everybody hear me okay? I just saw a thing in the chat that my connection's a little odd. Yes? Okay, good. Thanks. So I'm going to move to some definitions and measurements. And I do want to emphasize that definitions and measurements, that is a lot of the content in module 2. So any questions about that will hopefully be clarified in the next module. But I do want to highlight a couple of things that we have questions about in particular. One of those is the door requirements and how we're thinking about entry spacing and what those entry features actually are. So I have a couple slides to explain that. The first is that doors are required on ground story street-facing facades at a certain spacing. And this is to promote those more pedestrian-oriented environments. And I do want to emphasize that the spacing is tighter in areas that are higher intensity, that are meant to be more pedestrian-oriented. Where there are single-family residential, where you only have one unit on a lot, you would not be required to provide more than one door. If it is a single unit on a single lot, you only have to have one door on that. The spacing is essentially moot at that point. And the rules that would come out in module 2 would clarify some of these exceptions. Another piece of this is that a door must be part of an entry feature. And so it can't just be sort of a door stuck on the side of a building, right? There has to be something like a porch or a stoop, covered entries, recessed entries, forecourts. The sort of element of those entry features, they're pretty clearly defined, but they're relatively flexible of what it can be, but it has to be enhanced. There's some coverage from the rain, things like that. And I do want to emphasize that one of the things that we are carrying forward that exists, particularly in R4 and R5 today, is the requirement that in these residential districts, if there's a predominant pattern on the block of porches or stoops, that those would be required in a new construction building. And so anytime you see in those converted districts a star next to that entry feature, that is what that is indicating, that the predominant feature of a porch or stoop would need to be carried forward. If you'll go to the next slide. I want to show an example of some of the illustrations that you would see something like this in module 2. And this helps explain a lot of these measurements. Talks about how they're measured. When we say a raised entry or a forecourt or a porch or covered entry, what do we mean? How are we measuring that? What is the definition? So you can see by these images, we'll be creating these specific images for Atlanta and these typologies. But I do want to show these as an example. It's not just going to be a porch with no particular definition. We will define the requirements around what that entry feature would look like. Another piece of this is the question about, does a front door have to directly face on the street? And I think this is a great example. And what we say when there has to be a door, it means that the entry feature itself must be on a street-facing facade and must face the street, but the door within that entry feature doesn't necessarily have to face the street. So we're really trying to strike that balance of making sure that we get good design outcomes, but making sure that these are flexible enough to have for creativity, different architectural styles, things like that. And this is a great example of that. Another piece I want to talk about, you will notice in some of the districts that we reference different transition types. So as a placeholder right now, we've put in transition low, medium, and high. And these exist today in the code. And where they exist are when there are higher intensity districts next to lower intensity districts. And also when there are certain more intense uses like industrial uses adjacent to residential uses, we're requiring certain height transitions, certain buffers, and also certain screening associated with that. And so we'll be carrying that idea forward in the new code. If you'll go to the next slide, I'm going to talk through a couple of examples. So today, these different transitions are broken apart into different sections. So some have transitional yards, some have transitional buffers, and some have transitional height planes. They're located in different parts of the code. Sometimes they're a bit hard to understand and how they relate to one another. So one thing that we are thinking about in the new code is how we combine all three of these elements together, use graphics, and apply some more contextual standards so that they can be more easily understood, more easily administered, understood what the requirement actually is and when. And there will also be several types of those transitions. So those low transitions are, and this is an example from a different city. So a transition type A is sort of a low transition where you may have a residential area abutting up against a low density commercial area. And so you can see here that there are all of those elements that currently exist in the code. The height transition, the buffer, the screening, those all exist, but they're all together and they're illustrated. Another example of that is maybe in a higher intensity district where we're showing a lower intensity next to a much higher intensity. And one thing that I do want to point out is also being more explicit about what that landscape buffer looks like. So if you sort of look in the middle of this diagram, you see a tree and some shrubs. That's where we're talking about a transition screen. And if you look on the next slide, we actually go into defining what those transition screens can be composed of, and we give a couple options. So, you know, a transitional screen low, for example, has to have some sort of fence, a little bit higher one, and maybe the transition screen can be a little bit more shallow because it's a higher fence, or you have the option of doing a lower fence and having the deeper transition and landscape buffer. So we're trying to build all of these things together so that they are more easily understood, and it also provides a bit of flexibility for different contexts of, you know, sometimes you have more shallow lots, sometimes you have deeper lots, and we want to make sure that we're getting good outcomes in all of those scenarios. At this point, I'll pass it over for more questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Director Holmes. Thank you, Christy. What we wanted to do now was use this as an opportunity to answer any of your questions in real time. As a reminder, please use the question and answer feature, and our moderator will ask us the first questions, and we'll determine who's the best to answer it.
All right, first question. I'm in NPU and I would like to be able to put an ADU in my backyard. Any plans to rezone this area?
Which MPU was that?
NPU, they weren't specific.
I think it's I.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, it does say NPUI. That's right.
Kieta, you're on mute.
Properties that are in NPUI, which is in West Atlanta, are primarily zoned R4, except for R4 or R4 in a historic district. Properties that are in the base zoning R4 single family residential can today erect an accessory dwelling unit. That accessory dwelling unit cannot exceed 750 square feet. Should the property be in NPUI and be zoned R4 and also be in the Collier Heights Historic District, please contact the Historic Preservation Studio staff to discuss the addition of an accessory dwelling unit.
The draft does not include new conversion info about the NC16 Boulder Crest Triangle area in East Atlanta, which came into effect a month ago. Will NC16 be addressed in an updated version of the draft?
It will be, yeah. It is a very recent adoption, and we had finished this before the legislation was finalized, I believe.
That is correct.
This next question, what is R1 versus the new RH1 zone?
Christy?
Those are equivalent.
They're
I guess
both
to be
what,
more clear.
two acre lots?
Yes, so R1 in today's zoning has been converted to RH1, and all of the metrics are the same from today as they will be tomorrow.
Next question, were other cities referenced as precedents? Which ones? That would be for the zoning effort.
We're making a deliberate effort here to write an Atlanta code for Atlanta. We know that various cities across the country have done a lot of different things with zoning. As project manager for the consulting team, and I'm sure Director Holmes would agree, we have certainly looked at what other cities have done. Some of the ideas presented at the Idea Labs were from other places, but everything that has been put in this draft is specifically tailored to the needs of this city. And I hope that it's very evident as you go through the proposal.
How is current R4 property with 50-foot frontage handled in the new zoning where RN1 requires 70-foot frontage?
Christy, do you give me a second to look at to pull up the ordinance?
Yeah, I got it up. And it's, R4 has been converted to RN1, and all of the metrics with that have been converted over to RN1. So, even though that lot today may have a 50-foot frontage, it's just a non-conforming lot. And so it would continue to be non-conforming when this code would be adopted.
And to clarify there, you are allowed to build on a lot that does not meet the width of the zoning. That is a allowance in the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance. It's not like some places where if your lot doesn't meet every metric, you can't build on it. In Atlanta, if you have a platted lot that is zoned, you can build on it. You may need variances, you may need relief, but as Christy pointed out, a lot of our lots don't meet the zoning width requirements.
Can I also add this, that every single family district today, R1 through R5, has an immediate conversion in what is proposed in the form and frontage. So R1 has an immediate conversion to a new form and frontage code in what is being proposed. There is no elimination of any single family district. So you have a direct conversion of everything that is currently zoned R1 through R5 into the new code.
Can you describe how this effort is coordinated with the updates to the tree protection ordinance?
The tree protection ordinance is currently still being, I believe they just finalized their last stakeholder team meeting, I believe is what they were calling themselves, or stakeholder group. Those comments have not been formalized into a proposal. The Department of City Planning is coordinating not only with the tree protection ordinance changes, with the CTP, with any updates to the comprehensive plan to parks, any updates to the comprehensive development plan. This team that you see before you tonight is working in concert with all of those other ongoing efforts, and considering regulatory changes in consideration to those processes that are currently in process or will be adopted here pretty soon. We are not doing any of this in a vacuum. We're all talking to each other in tandem to make sure that the documents, once they are adopted, are providing the kinds of outcomes that you, the residents, have said you would like to see. Because they're pretty much all ongoing at the same time, we're all out before you presenting our individual parts, but please know that we are talking with each other to make sure that the outcomes are what the city wants them to be.
Okay, next we have a raised hand from Doug. Doug, are you able to unmute? I suppose while they're finding that, the next question we have in the chat, when will the draft full definitions and legal text be released?
Modules 2 and modules 3 are forthcoming. We'll give you plenty of lead time to know when those will be released. And as soon as we have finalized dates, we will post them to the web and to our website, our project website, and circulate them widely among the MPUs and throughout the community.
Okay, and we have a raised hand from Chucky. Chucky, are you able to unmute? Okay, we'll keep moving on to the next question. In regards to SPI 8, are there proposed parking changes in Home Park?
There are no proposed parking changes to SPI 8. We have not determined how we will apply that, but because it is specific to the Home Park neighborhood, it may turn into an overlay specifically for Home Park.
And Christopher, you may have to ask those with raised hands to unmute on the participant tab.
I think Chucky has unmuted.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
I sent a thing through the chat, and I know that in listening to the presentation tonight, sometimes when you get to some of the key components of your answers, it's going in and out, and somebody responding back that there was nothing wrong with their incoming on the outgoing ability to hear the presentation. That
You're cutting out, sir.
might be true that some people might not be having problems, but I'm also feel certain that there are others who may be having problems. So it would be a good idea if we could have this complete presentation put somewhere on the city website and let us know, those who are on this call tonight by email, that we can go and listen to complete questions and answers as
Yeah,
website.
Mr. Wilson, while you have been speaking with us, your audio has been going in and out. I can also tell you this is currently being live streamed, and this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for you to hear and review at your leisure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question, how will alleys be handled? Can they simply be split up between neighbors?
Alleys will continue to be regulated in the same way they're regulated now, where up to the center line of the alley is owned by or applicable to the immediately adjacent property owner.
We have a raised hand from Paul McMurray. Paul, are you able to unmute?
I just don't understand, in 2021, Z2174 was rejected, which was to increase ADUs and make them attached. And I don't see anything in the discussion why we were just going on as if that never happened. And we're not really having any serious discussion. One thing that concerns me is why in now R1 and R3, which will be RH in the future, are no ADUs allowed, but they are allowed in R4 through R5 or the RN districts. And the owner is not required to live in. So in other words, ADUs is just a way of increasing rental property in single family areas. So I just don't understand. So and also the fact that you can do it in R1 through R3, but not, I mean, you can do our ADUs in R4 and R5, but not in R1, R3. Isn't that sort of a racist and classist designation, which zoning laws are not allowed to follow?
Thank you for your question, Mr. McMurray. The properties that are currently zoned R1 through R3B were never had an allowance for an accessory dwelling unit. They've always had guest houses. From the progression or the introduction of accessory dwelling units in the city, it began with the more urban neighborhoods in the city. One being in 2017, when it was adopted into the R5 two-family zoning district regulations. Then in 2018, when Quick Fixes Phase 2 was adopted and it went through the public process, there was a request to add it to R4 and R4A, and it being accessory dwelling units. And that was approved by City Council. In the more urban neighborhoods, there is more likely a chance to be directly connected to high capacity transit or to a bus line. In the larger lot areas, R1 through R3A, there is likely not to be any direct connection to high capacity transit or an immediate bus line. If it is the desire of the city of Atlanta to eliminate accessory dwelling units, we would need to hear that in mass from those residents of the city. I think, however, that we have heard accessory dwelling units is something that people would like to have. We have adopted, we being the city have adopted into the code, and it has been in the code for at least 2 years now. I understand and hear your frustrations with regard to where they are currently allowed, but we are not putting forth anything that is not currently allowed in the zoning ordinance today.
The next question we have, does the city planning team anticipate an increase in variance requests should these proposed changes be permanent?
Actually, we anticipate a decrease in zoning and variance request. One variance that we get quite often with regard to setback adjustments with the cumulative setbacks that we are proposing, we anticipate fewer variance requirements. Depending on the determination of whether or not ADUs need to be in the buildable area or if they have their own setbacks, will determine whether or not we have variances with regard to ADUs.
I would like to add one thing there too. One of the things that Module 2 is going to do is have what I would call sort of alternative compliance options. For example, if you've read the code, you may have noticed that some zoning districts have maximum and minimum setbacks. If you've got a property that has a 150-year-old red oak tree, obviously the building should be able to be sited on the site in a way that doesn't require that tree to be cut. And so Module 2 is going to have alternative standards based on some conditions that we see across the city that are frequently used as justification for variances, but those will be pre-described in the code and will only be available when certain conditions are met.
We have a hand raised from Steve Pateau. Steve, are you able to unmute?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi, my question was in regards to R4 zones and subdivision of those particular lots. Is there like, I missed the majority of the earlier conversation, so maybe this was already discussed, but is there a path to getting rezoned and potentially subdividing larger lots that have space for additional single family dwellings?
Are you talking about in what's proposed or what is currently in the code?
I know what's in the code doesn't allow with the given frontage, and I missed what was being proposed. So I guess some of this is me catching up, wanting to know if that was already discussed.
We are not reducing the lot sizes for R4, and so without knowing your particular property, I would speculate that you would need to file a rezoning both under the current zoning and under the proposed, because we're just doing a one-to-one conversion.
Got it. Okay. And then so I just need to continue on with the rezoning path. It's not like any of the changes would change what the current frontage size is right now.
No, sir, it will remain 70 feet.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and we also have a hand raised from Tasha Mobley. Tasha, are you able to unmute?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, so I put this in the Q&A, but it didn't look like it got picked up. So I currently, we have property in NPU S, as in Sam, pretty large acreage in that area. Currently, there's a single family home. We have a single family ranch on that home. I'm sorry, on that lot. Am I correct that if we were to have that lot subdivided, that each lot would be allowed up to 2 ADUs?
Do you know what the property is zoned today?
R4.
If you subdivided the property and created 2 conforming R4 lots, you could construct 1 accessory dwelling unit per lot and 1 accessory structure per lot.
Okay, and this correct me if I'm wrong, the accessory structure is like the guest house type
That is
example?
correct.
Okay, so is there any other zoning that can be converted up to that would allow for more than 1 ADU?
No, ma'am.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Our next question, what is CR2?
CR2 is one of the 2 conservation districts that I mentioned earlier. CR1 is Conservation Residential 1, which is identical to the R3 zoning district, except it limits building height to the height of adjacent houses. CR2 is identical to the R4 zoning district, except it limits building height to the height of the adjacent houses. None of these would be mapped initially.
I do want to clarify, it's RC1 and RC2.
RC.
So yeah, just flip those first 2 letters.
Sorry, it's my initial, so I invariably go for CR.
In honor of Caleb.
Yes.
Our next question, can guest units be rented out?
Is this a future question or a current question?
They don't specify, but I imagine future.
Yes.
And to clarify,
I'm sorry, no. Guest units will not be able to be rented out. Guest units are only permitted in the larger lots districts, and they must be owner occupied.
Our next question, my residential property is currently zoned R4, has street frontage of 60 feet. Every lot on the street is 60 feet. Size of lot is 9,600 square feet. Does this lot convert to U1 or U2?
It is a 1-to-1 conversion, yes.
So U2.
When will these new zoning requirements be put into effect?
I'll let Director Holmes answer that.
So we've just dropped module 1. We have module 2 and module 3 to go before we can present a final draft to start the legislative process. Please note that there will be a question and answer, a session just like this one for module 2 and for module 3. And once we have a final discussion draft posted, we'll have that posted for quite some time, and then we will start the legislative process. So that will be sometime in 2025.
Does the new zoning ordinance change any zoning lines?
No.
Would we still have to go through the SAP review for SPI districts?
The special administrative permit requirements have not been finalized yet, as in no processes have been finalized. Once module 3 is revealed to the public or released to the public, you'll have a clearer understanding as to how special administrative permits will be administered and processed.
Are there any parts of the existing zoning code that have been moved to the list of excluded topics?
I'm not following that question.
They don't have any other specifics in there. I suppose we can just move on. Is there a limit on the number of ADUs a neighborhood, street, or block can have? I am in NPUI.
Okay, so NPUI primarily has R4 zoning. However, there are portions of that NPU that have larger lots, so they are zoned R3. And then I believe there also may be some R2 or 2A lots in NPUI as well. There is no limitation on any street in the city of Atlanta as the number of ADUs that can be built. The limitation is per the zoning district. Only properties that are zoned today, R4, R4A, and R5, regardless of which NPU you are in, can construct an accessory dwelling unit.
We have a hand raised from Daniel Solberg. Daniel, are you able to unmute?
Hey, thanks for being there. Can you hear me?
We can.
I've been identified, my street has been identified as a conservation area in Atlanta. Is that something that's in effect currently, or something that goes into effect later?
I believe you're referring to the Atlanta City Design, which dates from several years ago. That designation was intended to reflect sort of the existing patterns. I would imagine it's more of a wooded neighborhood. Is that correct?
Yeah, in Edgewood.
So it is already shown in the Atlanta City Design. That is part of the City of Atlanta Charter, and that is one of the documents that is being used to really guide the comprehensive development plan process. But yes, it is currently on the books, if you will, in the City of Atlanta.
Thanks.
All right, we also have a hand raised from Andre Payne. Andre, are you able to unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
My question would be to the SPI districts. Would any of those protocols change? Just for the simple fact that when you're going through, I do a lot of new construction in the city, and when you're going to build and you got to go through the SPI district, you are typically, it's like a 4-month process just to get a permit, because the SPI, the SAP process is 45 days off the top, and then it has to still go through a review process after you go through the board, and then it has to go through the regular building permit process.
Kiera, you're on mute.
What's that?
SAP process is regulated by the state of Georgia under the zoning procedures law. So that that portion of the process will not change. What may change is what triggers a special administrative permit, and if that special administrative permit is not triggered, or that process is not triggered, you may be able to go directly to permitting. But again, that is in module 3. And we have not finalized all of the regulations related to processes associated with SAPs as of yet.
Gotcha.
Will HOA rental restrictions of short-term rentals take precedent over the zoning code?
Yes.
What's the best way to see how areas are going to be zoned?
Again, what I would do, and this is a great segue, I would first go to the Atlanta zoning map. You can find your zoning by just Googling Atlanta zoning map. You can pull it up and you can find what you're zoned. Then you would go to our website, atlzoning.com, and there is a link to review the draft ordinance. In that link, there is a table, so you can find what your current zoning is and then see what your proposed zoning is. So the first thing would go to find your zoning on the Atlanta zoning map, and then go to the atlzoning.com website to see how it converts to the new proposed zoning.
Unfortunately, Atlanta GIS is down currently, so you may need to try that later in this week. We're currently having a server issue and GIS is not operational. But I do encourage you to go and find out where your current zoning is and then view the conversion map to find out what you will be converted to.
But do not trust what is on your county tax record.
Ever.
Because the tax record is always wrong.
Always.
My property is in NPUT, as in Tom. It is a duplex on Lucille Avenue that once used to be multi-unit. Am I allowed an accessory dwelling unit on the property?
Yes.
We have a hand raise from Sky Hassan. Let's see here. Sky, are you able to unmute? It looks like they're unmuted, but okay. I'm scrolling through our questions here. 1 second. What is the effect on property values from ADUs?
I couldn't tell you. I don't know.
Sorry.
Okay, for RN5, you are allowed to have a duplex and an ADU. Does this apply if there's an ADU that has 2 units and the principal structure is used as a single family?
I'm sorry, repeat that.
For RN5, you are allowed to have a duplex and an ADU. Does this apply if there is an ADU that has 2 units and the principal structure is used as a single family?
I think the question is, Kieta, if there is an existing single family unit and they have a legal non-conforming 2-unit accessory structure, can they have another?
No.
I wouldn't think they could.
No.
They could.
No.
Will the presentation slides be made available after the meeting?
They will be made available hopefully tomorrow. Our webmaster can get them on the project website. And as was mentioned, the video will also be available as soon as possible. And it's being live streamed on YouTube, and we just need a couple of hours to get it uploaded.
NPUI is mostly R3. What changes are proposed for this zoning? Will it still be single family? Is there any increase in density?
There is no change to any single family zoning district in the city. It is a 1-to-1 conversion for all single family properties in the city, NPUs A through Z. There is no change. There is no rezonings associated with the zoning ordinance rewrite. There are no changes to what your current zoning is today, other than there will be a new letter and a letter form combination. So instead of seeing R1, it will be RH1, for example. It is a 1-to-1 conversion for single family here in the city of Atlanta. Single family zoning will continue in ATL 2.0. So if you're in a single family zoned property today, such that this would be adopted in 2025 or 2026 or 2027, there will be a single family zoning district for you to live in then as well.
We have a hand raised from James Carson. James, are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, good. I just have a couple of questions. When you're counting the heights or the stories in a building, are basements and attics counted? And the second question is, with the new modules, do you anticipate impacts on assessments for taxation?
Christy, I will allow you to, or Director Holmes, I'll allow you to answer the first question.
So in module 2, we will clarify how basements and attics either would or would not be counted depending on where they exist on the property, the topography associated with it. And so there will be very clear definitions for that and illustrations to go along with it. So it'll be clear in what instances they would and would not count. And Director Holmes, I don't know if you have any comment on the tax assessor, but zoning really is not going to have a significant impact on that.
Which was going to be my comment with regard to tax assessment. Zoning does not has no effect on tax assessment. Tax assessment is a separate process and is not even governed by zoning. It is governed by the tax assessors of the appropriate county.
Thank you very much.
We have about 3 minutes. Do we want to discuss next steps or do we want to take more questions?
Are there any hands raised?
Yes, we do. We have 4 more hands raised.
We'll
Okay.
take those 4 last questions.
Okay, and a few folks we've already heard from. So I'm gonna pick somebody we haven't heard from yet. Jeanette Berthold. Jeanette, are you able to unmute? I wonder. Okay, we'll try Sky Hassan again. Sky, are you able to unmute?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry about that. It was more a comment from a friend that was trying to, had to drop off the meeting. They were basically raising concerns about the fact that removing an owner occupancy requirement for ADUs in, say, historically R4 and R5 zones could result in those ADUs, especially in, like in R5, you'd be able to build a ton of ADUs now. You could theoretically commercialize them and kind of turn them into de facto apartment complexes outside of the intended scope. So that's sort of a, just point to kind of look at and make sure it doesn't turn into some sort of loophole / unintended effect, since a lot more ADUs would be allowed. And, more ADUs, good. It's just we don't want them to be sort of turned into apartment complexes that could be taken advantage of and could, drive up prices in a way that is not intended.
I don't believe there's an owner occupied requirement today in R4 or R5. Director Holmes, can you confirm that?
There isn't. There is not. If the community at large wants to see an owner occupied requirement for accessory dwelling units, please note that that is hard to enforce. Zoning enforcement and code enforcement cannot verify whether or not a unit is owner occupied unless they have access. Meaning that means the property owner would have to allow them onto the property and then to review documents to say whether or not the property is owner occupied. That is extremely hard to enforce. Just wanted to provide that comment.
Will the changes for the new zoning ordinance still allow a developer or a builder to build a significantly larger home than the one that is demolished on the original pad?
The FAR requirements would govern the size of the home. Should it be a home that was built prior to the current development controls or the current FAR being established on the property, that home may be larger. But there is residential conservation districts that are proposed as a part of these regulations that could limit the height of that new home in accordance with the heights of the other homes on the street. And so that may be a consideration of the neighborhoods should this regulations be adopted to apply residential conservation requirements to or zoning districts on those properties.
I also wanted to mention one of the changes in the house districts is we are introducing not only the idea of lot coverage, which we already have, but we're also introducing the idea of building coverage, which effectively would not allow you to cover the entire lot with a building and then just have a sort of drive under parking garage in the front. So there would be a new standard that would regulate the footprint of the building under the proposed ordinance that is not in place today.
And Caleb, I did want to clarify, that's in the residential neighborhood districts.
Residential neighborhood, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That where that's being introduced. I would also add that we've added a couple more metrics where we're trying to think about managing that bulk and mass, particularly in the areas of the city with the smaller scale lots. In many of the districts, we have proposed height at 2.5 stories, and introducing a building width requirement that would help with that massing as you're sort of walking down the street. So introducing a few more tools to try to manage that a bit more.
Will guest be defined, and are there limits in terms of duration, number of people, and whether they are related to the owner?
In general, definitions will be coming in module 2. So we will be clearly defining guest house or guest unit. We'll clearly defining accessory unit, and all of the standards associated with each of those uses.
In the use definitions, why are there different standards based on geography? For example, daycare uses not allowed west of Joseph E. Lowry Boulevard.
Yeah.
That's the
so
regulation in the SPI today.
that is the current standard. If the community would like to support daycare and doesn't support that, and you live in Ashview Heights, use the website, let us know. But that is a current regulation in that area.
Okay.
Is that it?
Oh, there are plenty of other questions.
Well, for the sake of time, I think we are going to stop the Q&A, but we will be documenting all of your questions. Additionally, I would highly encourage everyone to take advantage of the project website, again, atlzoning.com. For the past month and a half since the ordinance has been unveiled, we have been going in almost daily and responding to questions in there. So if you have a question about, for example, the door requirements in RN4, you can actually go to the draft ordinance, you can go to RN4, and then you'll see there's a little yellow dot, and that means someone asked a question, and you can see what the answer is. And so we're doing it really based on where it is in the ordinance. With that said, we are going to be looking at the questions that are submitted in the chat, and we are going to be updating the sort of responses based on that. That'll be posted on the project website under this particular meeting, and then very likely on the FAQ as well. But just give us a little bit of time. I think we have over 99 potential questions to answer, but that will be coming to the project website. I'll turn it over to Director Holmes to talk about next steps.
So we want to thank you as a department. The Department of City Planning wants to thank you for all of your engagement with the zoning, ATL Zoning 2.0, as well as the Comprehensive Development Plan. We'd especially like to thank you for attending the one or many or more than one of the 29 meetings that we've had thus far with regard to the Comprehensive Development Plan. And we really, really thank you for your input, and we request for you to continue to provide your input in that process to inform the vision of the city of Atlanta. The next step with regard to the CDP is the actual NPU maps. Those maps will start coming out to you. You will find members of the Office of Design coming and circulating those NPU maps and ensuring that what you said you wanted to have in your NPUs is listed on those maps and shown on those maps for further adoption. So please, please, please go to your NPU meetings and make sure that you are opining on those maps and saying what you want and where you want it. With regard to the zoning ordinance rewrite, we are in the public comment period. We've been asked several times, when are comments due? Comments are not due until not due until the final draft of the zoning ordinance draft is posted to the web. That is when we will stop taking comments. So please use all of the processes, the phone, the web, the Conveyo, all things that we have to provide public comment to this draft, as well as to the following the next 2 modules when they come out. At any time, if you would like to directly email me and you don't remember any of the other places to provide comment, you can email me directly at KM Holmes, and that's KM HOLMES@atlantagaga.gov. Again, we thank you for your time this evening. We welcome your public input and your engagement. And please believe that we will be taking all of those to heart and providing those comments and updating the documents as necessary. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone.